what I want to talk to you about is with flows, you're going to come across a lot of opinions about flows. So whilst this talk is not about best practices, there are best practices to be covered. Okay. Now, as Chuck mentioned, I know there's some of you that are new to flow, and some of you more experienced with flow, and some of you developers. What I hope is that you'll take everything, anything away from here. It will help you no matter what level you are. I've got a few things to show you about tips that I would recommend to start if you want to learn flows. Learning flows is another thing, but then I just want you to have these questions before you even delve into looking at flows. Okay, so this is a very opinionated talk, but I have to come from my own background, which is a Salesforce administrator, developer, consultant, and architect, but only working for small to medium businesses. Okay, so if you work for a very large enterprise or banking or health or anything like that, where your stuff is mission critical and absolutely, life-threatening if something goes wrong, of course, ignore everything I'm saying. You will have a very different approach to the way you deal with anything on your Salesforce platform. And I have to address that there are developers out there who will just, whatever is brought up about flows, will just say absolutely not. Okay, has anyone come across that type of person who is just outright, you will never have a flow in my org, or I'll never have touch a flow ever. I will leave Salesforce before I touch a flow. Okay, there are going to be people like that, and there are so many people that just say, I only ever want to have one automation per object. So if you've got an account object, that you can only ever have triggers and Apex code against that account object. So, but then as soon as you install an App Exchange app, so many App Exchange apps have workflow rules built into them, right? So therefore you've got two automation objects. Managed package has triggers in it. That means you could never use flows, right? So again, these sort of really polarizing views, just, you've got to think about, like, where are they coming from? Are they a company that has an automated CI/CD process where their code is like plugged into a GitHub and then never touched human hands before it's made to production? Then this is not for you, right? But that's what I'm saying. If you live in the real world, where we're building the functionality on top of the Salesforce platform, utilizing everything the Salesforce platform has to offer, then we have to balance all of this out. Okay, so there's no absolute rules about this stuff. Okay, so the 1x per y, the rule for process builders was one process builder per object. That was just the most dumbest thing that Salesforce has ever come up with. Not the most. It's probably, I said, one of the top 10 bad decisions by Salesforce. But basically, process builder is just DEDD. Gone. Forget about it. Don't touch process builders ever again, except for bit by bit detangling them and getting them into flows. Okay. Before you do anything with flows, or any coding or any automation on the Salesforce platform, you really need to know your order of execution. Okay, so if you've done your platform dev 1 certification, that really focuses on order of execution. But flows in the last couple of releases released before safe flows, and before safe flows are so special that they needed to put a new layer in the order of execution. Okay, so the order of execution is what happens when you click the save button. So you're on a Salesforce record. When you click the save button, what happens behind the scenes? If you can't talk to someone and tell someone what happens behind the scenes, and like even to the point of like how, I love to thinking about like how is it even saved in the database. Some of them are now in Australia with Hyperforce. But like when it gets to that database in that server, how does it get there and how does it get saved there? I like to go to that level, but at least to know the order of execution when we're talking about before save flows or after save flows, you need to understand what that means. Okay, so that's a bit of a study point to get to that, to be comfortable with that before you really delve into flows. So this diagram is pretty cool, even though it is not quite up to date. So when you hit the save button, the very first thing it's going to do is have a look at system validations, which is there a required field? Have you set a field required in your objects? So that's the very first thing it's going to check, right? And then there's the before triggers will raise. And then the custom validations. Have you set a validation rule that says the state must be Hawaii, right? So if you put a record in where the state's not Hawaii, it says no, can't do it. So that's even going to happen in the very next thing. The very next thing it'll check for, do you have any duplicates, right? And then the very next thing we'll do is it will try to save that record. Okay, it hasn't actually saved it to the database yet. It's actually just going to go there and say, hey, database, this is what I think it might be. It might look like after I save it. But then all the after triggers will run, and then the assignment rules, and then auto response rules, and then workflow actions. So this one, and see, it's got processes and flows at 13, whereas now before save comes in even before triggers now for flows. So, and there's lots of loops and the loops around, and this is how we can get into troubles with our limits, because you might have an update that will get into a loop. Yeah, an updated diagram. I didn't sort of delve into this. There are many diagrams for this whole auto execution. Of course, there is the one that is on the list that's on the documentation. Now, Salesforce does have their own diagrams, which they've got in their training documents. They don't put them on the help documents. So, so this is where number 3 is the new thing that came in. So this diagram is basically exactly the same, but at number 3, there's a new section in there that is before triggers. So this is why I like this diagram, because it's quite simple. There are many other diagrams. If you just do an order of execution diagram, you can see these. Okay, so it's all the bits to do with flows and assignment rules and auto response rules and validation rules and everything you use as an admin. It's really good to know when they happen. Before you start thinking of flows, should you actually build flow or should you code? And this is trying to address that, yes, in some cases you might need to code. And in a lot of cases, flow is going to be enough for what you need, okay? But it's not an either or. You can actually build flows that go and invoke code, and that's called invocable Apex. So you can have the best of both worlds. You can have your developers write some really cool Apex code that does some really cool stuff with the whole set of records, and then they can just make that code invocable. So it adds a few extra lines and the way that they have to build that code, but then you can call that, or you can trigger that code from flow. So you don't have to build every single thing into flow and have, like some developers say, you'll have a complete mess. And yes, so I've built some flows that are a complete mess, right? And when you've got just one developer on the team, I can probably get away with it. But as soon as you've got 2 or more and you've got to work together, then you're going to have some documentation and some processes around this, okay? Just like you do when you code, all right? So flow is a form of coding, even though it's a low code tool or a declarative tool. It is a way of coding. So just please don't let people turn you off saying that you shouldn't be doing flow. That's my biggest message today, right? And It's not about, developers should not ever say, I'm never going to touch a flow. People who, administrators should never say, I'm never going to code. Is there another way to achieve this, the thing that you want to do? There's a tool called Declarative Lookup Rollup Summaries, or another tool called Mass Action Scheduler that I use a lot to not have to think about coding things from scratch. So Declarative Lookup Rollup Summaries is a way of quickly and easily creating rollups that you can't do on the standard Salesforce fields. So rollups standard are very, very, very limited. You have to be in a master detail object relationship, whereas Declarative Lookup Rollup Summaries, it's a little hard to get your head around how it works, but once you do, it's so powerful, right? And it was built by a guy called Andy Fawcett, who is now works at Salesforce in the developer area. It was sort of like, for a few years, we were worried about the future of the tool because Andy couldn't look after it anymore. But it's just recently been bought out by, so been taken over by Salesforce Commons. So Salesforce Commons is part of the Salesforce.org, the nonprofit area, and Salesforce Commons has a suite of completely open source tools. And so they have just bought Declarative Lookup Rollup Summaries into that. The next rule is a workflow rule enough? So like, if your workflows are there and working, and you've got approval processes and a field updates around approval processes, maybe do not change them yet. The killing off of workflow rules is not for a number of years yet, and workflow rules work really quite well. Okay, it's turn them on and they work. They do. They very rarely get into any issues with bulkifications or any errors or anything like that. If they're not messing anything else up with what you're doing with flows, maybe just don't touch them. Okay, so but one area where you might want to change workflow rules is when you've got so many different field updates, and you want to put them all in one place. And so putting them all in one flow might be a better way. But that's just for your ease of maintaining them. But if they're functioning, then there's not, at the moment, there's no real need to change them. Whereas a few years ago, I was moving a big process from one object to another. We had to restructure to it better suit the way this records were going to be integrated with another system. So now you've thought about, should you be building flows? So the answer is yes, definitely. The next part is before you start building your flows. And naming convention is really important to start your organizing of your naming conventions first. With the great new features to have your list views in flows, it is really cool that you can name things and then build your list views based on those names. I've got a whole post on naming grouping, but it's generally like account before create and update always. So you know how we used to on workflow rules do an always action where we do just the criteria is just true. So every single time that record is saved, that workflow rule would always run, and therefore you know that formula is always going to be up to date. So I do this a lot because I have so many formulas that are based on dates and date ranges and comparing dates to today, or really complex currency and percentage and margin formulas. And I so often hit the 5,000 compiled character limits on formulas. And I therefore have to then put that formula into either a workflow rule or a flow, and then save that onto the record as a static value. Okay. And so I want that every single time that record changes in any way, shape or form by whoever, I want that field to be updated. So those fields will run in a flow called always. that's got no criteria. It just runs whenever. And I know that that takes a hit on the how fast things run in Salesforce. But I don't know that if you have the similar thing in Hawaii, but because of our latency of our servers having to get from Melbourne to Japan and back on a save, but it's slow anyway, right? So it doing a whole heap of things on the server we don't see that. I think the fastest I've seen Salesforce run is when I was in Vancouver, and they just had a big internet pipe built directly from Japan to Seattle, and so I was really close to that pipe, and it was very fast there. We're seeing, like with Hyperforce now with the Australian servers, we're seeing a latency drop from 200 milliseconds to 20 milliseconds. So huge benefit for us being on the Australian servers now. Okay, so opportunity is after update is 1. So I group things like we've got a whole everything that happens after the opportunity is 1 is in that flow, and I've got another flow that is that happens like on create or update when an opportunity is open, because I don't need that logic to be considered for the is 1 opportunities if I'm saving an open opportunity. I don't need any of that logic to be considered. So I put that into complete separate flows. That whole flow is not even considered. It just gets to that criteria and says, no, don't need to do anything with that. So that's a really good reason to use to create multiple flows. Okay, and person accounts. Anything that triggers on your personal accounts is probably not going to trigger on your regular accounts. So you're going to have 2 different flows on that. Okay, so we start to see there's really good reasons to have multiple flows per object. So it doesn't really matter what naming convention you use. In Monica's video that I've linked to up here, she has the most amazing naming convention in Windio's post in SFXD Wiki. He has an amazing naming convention, right? And again, you've got to see where they're coming from. They're coming from larger organizations where they need a lot more organization, whereas I don't need that. So I've just got a naming convention that works for me. So it doesn't really matter what your naming convention is, but be consistent. Right? So Monica's got a spreadsheet that she uses to document her naming convention so that everyone else can see what that means. I would love there to be a documentation element on flows. There isn't at the moment. So you can't actually, there's only the description field in a couple of different elements, but not every single element. So there's not a great documentation features for flows at the moment. So, but just name them in such a way that you can group all active account flows in one list view. If I had a field on the account record where the account was active or not inactive, right, then I would want to have that active thing. If that was a really important part of my process for my accounts, I want to have that word active in each one of my flow names, so that then I could, have all flows that are active working on accounts that are active in one list view. Okay, so here is a record, straight standard account record with a related record component using a quick action and a flow, which does something similar. And you can see here that the flow is in edit mode straight away. And of course, that was a simple flow. You could build it that was in view mode and then go edit mode. But this one here, you edit, right? And then you can save it, okay? And it looks, so in edit mode, it looks different to the rest of the objects. So it looks funny, right? And here, this one still looks a bit different because this has not got compact layout, whereas this has got compact layout, but it still looks as much as possible like the existing record. So this one took 2 minutes to build, and this one could take an hour to build, okay? And one of the interesting things that is in Winter 22 is the little gauge that tells you how long things take to load. And as I said, with our latency issues, then it's how long the page takes to load is really important. So predicted page load time 3.5 seconds, but let's have a look at the performance breakdown. Of course, related to list quick links, it's like, why have that? Okay, another topic. Okay, but the flow is 223 milliseconds to load, and the related record component is 20 milliseconds to load, right? So that just tells me, just do not put screen flows on the page. So if you want to do a screen flow, put it behind a tab. So they have to open the tab, which opens the screen flow. But there's just no place for screen flows to be on a page. In that flow, I use the functionality of record fields that came out 2 releases ago. It's not ready for prime time yet, and it didn't get any updates in the current release. And I've got some other cool, really advanced things that you can do with flows. Okay, that putting Lightning Web Components in flows, using external services to work with external data in other systems into flows, using the excellent flow data table component, and on the App Exchange, there's already pre-built flow solutions and pre-built components that can probably do what you've already wanting to build in flow anyway.